When the bullet tore through my chest, shattering the rib and burrowing deep into the tissue beside my heart, I didn't scream. I had learned long before that night, long before the tires left the asphalt and the world spun violently into a ditch, that silence was the only thing that ever kept me safe. But lying there in the crumpled wreckage of my car, gasoline hissing like a venomous snake and blood pooling warm and sticky against my skin, I heard something that broke me more than the bullet ever could. Through the cracked dashboard, the radio flickered to life, cutting through the sound of the rain and the dying engine. A voice, steady, calm, and terrifyingly familiar, drifted through the static. It was a voice from my childhood, a voice that had ruled my life with an iron fist. "You never learned how to follow orders, Augusta Fairchild." It was Evan Marks, my stepfather. And in that moment, staring up at the darkened canopy of trees through a shattered windshield, I realized he hadn't just tried to kill me. He was aiming for my obedience, one last time. And for the first time in my life, I decided not to obey. If you have ever felt trapped by someone who held power over you, if you have ever waited for the day when the tables would turn and the truth would finally see the light of day, then this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn off your notifications, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this journey from survival to absolute, undeniable justice. The forest that night was nothing but a suffocating blanket of fog and the harsh, sweeping glare of my own headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. The tires hissed underneath me, a rhythmic warning that I had chosen to ignore, the smell of pine thick in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of adrenaline that flooded my mouth. Static flickered through the radio, soft and persistent, like a heartbeat I couldn't quiet, drowning out the world until it was just me and the road. I reached out, fingers trembling slightly, to turn the volume down, craving the silence that usually settled my nerves, when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat beside me. The screen lit up the dark interior of the car with a name I hadn't seen in 20 years. Evan Marks. For a second, swerving slightly on the wet road, I thought I was hallucinating. That name had been buried under decades of distance, under layers of trauma I had tried to scrub clean, yet there it was, pulsing on the screen like a wound. My hand hesitated, hovering over the device, my pulse hammering in my throat so hard I could hear it in my ears, before I finally swiped to answer. "It's been a long time, Gus." The voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You still drive alone at night?" I gripped the steering wheel harder until my knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under the pressure. "What do you want, Evan?" The question came out as a snarl, a mix of fear and rage that had been festering for half my life. He chuckled softly, a sound that scraped against old memories like a knife against bone. "Just wanted to know if my little soldier still remembers how to follow orders." The words hit harder than the cold air seeping through the cracked window, harder than the rain lashing against the glass. Before I could hang up, before I could summon the venom to tell him to stay out of my life, a thin red beam swept across my steering wheel. It was steady, unblinking, a pinpoint of light that didn't belong there. Then came the gunshot. It was a sound that exists outside of time, a concussive crack that shattered reality. Glass exploded inward, a million glittering diamonds raining down on me. The world tilted violently. Metal screamed as the car lost traction, spinning off the road and plunging into the ditch below. The airbag deployed, punching me in the face, but the pain in my shoulder was sharper, hotter, something tearing through flesh with the precision of a scalpel. Smoke filled the cabin, a toxic mix of gasoline, burnt rubber, and the copper tang of my own blood. The radio crackled again, the white noise forming the shape of his voice, whispering the only thing I could manage to say before everything went black. "This wasn't random," I breathed, tasting iron on my tongue. "He sent someone." And then there was nothing, only silence and the faint, mocking echo of his voice reminding me that monsters don't always stay buried in childhood. I still dream about that house on the hill, the one that sat like a fortress overlooking the valley, where the grass was always cut too short and the silence was always too loud. That was where everything had to stay in perfect order, where the chaos of human emotion was beaten into submission. It started after my father's funeral, a day that was gray and blurry, but for the image of Evan Marks arriving in his pressed uniform. He looked like a statue carved from granite, offering my mother a hand that felt more like a shackle. "You'll never have to worry again," he told her, his voice booming with false confidence. "I'll make this home disciplined." And he did. He turned our house into a barracks, a place where life was measured in minutes and obedience. 6 a.m. sharp, the whistle would blow outside my door, jarring me from sleep. 7, breakfast in silence, where the clinking of silverware was the only conversation allowed. 8, inspection, where he would run a white-gloved finger along the doorframes, checking for dust that wasn't there, looking for any excuse to exert his dominance. I remember once I was 12 years old, and I had left a history book on the kitchen table, open to a chapter about revolutions. He slammed it shut so hard the plates rattled in the cupboard, his face inches from mine. "Orders first, learning later," he spat. My mother stood by the stove, her back to us, whispering, "He means well, Gus. He wants us to be strong." But I saw her hands, shaking as she held a spatula, trembling with a fear I didn't understand yet. When I asked about my father, longing for a story, a memory, a connection to the man who had loved me, Evan shut it down flat. "There's no room for ghosts in my command," he said, his eyes devoid of empathy. From then on, I learned not to ask. I learned that curiosity was a defect, and that silence was the only armor I had. At night, hiding under the covers with a flashlight I had stolen from the garage, I wrote 3 words in a spiral notebook I hid beneath my pillow. "I will leave." It was a mantra, a prayer, and a promise all rolled into one. Years later, long after I had finally escaped that house, I learned the depth of his betrayal. He hadn't just broken my spirit, he had stolen my legacy. He had used my father's life insurance money, the money meant to raise me and send me to college, to start Mark's Tactical Solutions, a private military contracting firm. He called it a tribute to my father, a way to carry on his legacy of service, but it was just a monument to his own ego. I remember the night he broke me completely. He made me stand at attention in the living room, staring at the large portrait of my father that hung over the fireplace. "He was weak," Evan said, circling me like a predator. "He had no discipline." Then, without warning, he took the frame off the wall and threw it to the floor. The glass shattered, my father's face staring up at me through a spiderweb of cracks. "A soldier doesn't mourn," Evan shouted, spraying spittle in my face. "She obeys." I felt a warm trickle running from my nose, blood dripping onto my father's shattered face, and when I looked up, Evan was smiling. That was the day fear learned my name, and I knew I had to run. I wrote my mother every single month after I left. I poured my heart into those letters, telling her about my training, about the bases I was stationed at, about the woman I was becoming. I wanted her to know I was okay, that I still loved her, that I was waiting for her to find the courage to leave him too. But no letter ever came back. Not one. For years, I thought she was angry. I thought he had poisoned her against me, convinced her that I was ungrateful, that I had abandoned her. It wasn't until years later, after I had been discharged and returned to that empty, echoing house, that I found the truth. I was looking for old documents in the attic when I found a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a stack of envelopes, yellowed with age. I pulled them out, my hands shaking, and realized they were my letters. Hundreds of them. Each sealed, each stamped, each marked in angry red ink across the seal. One word: selfish. I fell to my knees, the dust motes dancing in the light shafting through the attic vents, and I couldn't breathe. He hadn't just stolen my voice, he had cut the lifeline between us. My mother had never stopped waiting for me, never stopped loving me, but Evan had told her I wanted nothing to do with her. He had intercepted her love and my longing, using them to control us both. He didn't kill my father, but he had made sure I lost both of them. When I stood up to leave, the floor creaked beneath me, soft and hollow, sounding for all the world like a heartbeat buried alive. He hadn't erased my letters, he had erased me. The crash that night should have killed me, but the paramedics said I was lucky, though luck felt like a cruel joke. The bullet had passed through the meat of my shoulder, missing the artery by millimeters, shattering the scapula before exiting. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, drifting in and out of morphine-induced hazes, but when I woke up, the anger was a cold, hard stone in my gut. After 8 weeks of recovery, I returned to the base where I worked as a civilian consultant, acting as if nothing had changed, but the room smelled like memory, and every shadow looked like a threat. The auditorium lights washed over the faces of colleagues I had known my whole career, people I trusted, people I respected. Applause rose the moment the MC called his name. Evan Marks stepped onto the stage in a gray suit that cost more than my car, a ribbon pinned to his lapel, and the room treated him like a war hero, like a savior. "True discipline isn't about fear," he said, his voice amplified, echoing off the walls. "It's about structure." The words landed like a sentence, a condemnation of everything I knew to be true. I left before the standing ovation ended, the cheer hollow in my ears, feeling sick to my stomach. That evening, I drove to my mother's small house in Wilmington, a property he had generously provided for her. A brass plaque by the door read, "Mark's Tactical Accounting," a cruel joke considering he controlled every penny she had. Her smile was thin, stretched tight across her face, her hands trembling over a teacup as she sat in the living room. "People trust him," she whispered when I asked why he was still involved in her life, why she still did his taxes, why she still lived in his shadow. "Provides for me, Gus. He keeps me safe." The photo of my father was gone from the mantelpiece. In its place hung a large, illuminated portrait of Evan in his dress uniform, framed in gold with a stitched motto beneath it. "Discipline brings peace." I felt the room shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thin. Later that night, back in my apartment, an anonymous email arrived in my work inbox. It was simple, terrifyingly direct. "Welcome home, little soldier. Try not to dig too deep." The sender was listed as unknown, but the header data told a different story. Mark's Tactical. Calm. Calculated. It read like a warning, a shot across the bow. I realized then that the line between my past and my present had been braided together by his reach, extending into my mother, into the base, into the life I thought I had built miles away from him. I started pulling records in the dark archive of the administrative building, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the hum of the servers. I was looking for anything linking him to the shell companies I knew he used. I found it on a dusty terminal in the back corner, a transfer dated June 2nd, 2 days before the shooting. $9,800. The memo line read, "Training support fee," routed from my mother's personal savings account to a shell company linked to Mark's Tactical. The beneficiary name cut through me like a knife, Clint Barker, Retton Sniper. The date matched the week before I was shot perfectly. My mother's eyes filled with the old, practiced fear when I showed her the printout the next day, her tea rattling in the saucer. "He said it was for equipment," she murmured, looking at the floor. "For security upgrades. Please don't make him angry, Gus. He scares me." I left her house feeling more determined than ever. I rifled through a dusty box labeled field contracts that I had borrowed from the records office and found a faded photo tucked inside a manila folder. It was Evan, younger but just as stern, surrounded by a ring of men, their caps embroidered with Fort Liberty's insignia. Barker was in the back row, his jaw set, his eyes dead. It was a face I had seen once before, in a hazy memory of the hospital waiting room after the shooting, a man asking questions that were too specific, Chinese letter, too much about my condition. When I exported the files to my drive, the monitor blinked and a blue warning flashed on the screen. "Unauthorized access logged by EM." He knew I was looking. He always knew. I stayed at the base long after everyone else had gone home, the hum of the servers the only sound in the vast, empty room. When my phone lit up on the desk, the message was short, surgical, and terrifying. "You should have stayed off my radar." 10 seconds later, it vanished. No number, no history, no trace. Sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red dot on the steering wheel, heard the sound of the glass shattering. By morning, I was standing inside the FBI field office at Fort Liberty, clutching my phone like a piece of evidence that no longer existed. They listened, they nodded, they filed a report for federal employee threat, but the room went cold when I said his name. Evan Marks. One agent, a man with tired eyes and a thin mouth, cleared his throat and said softly, "He's got powerful friends, ma'am. Government contracts, political donors. Be careful not to make this political." That was when I realized the depth of the swamp I was wading into. Evan didn't just control a family. He had built himself a fortress of bureaucracy and connections. I walked out of that office feeling more alone than I had in years, but I knew there was one person left who might listen. I called Leela Crow. We had served together overseas, and she had the same clipped tone she used when defusing IEDs. "You don't need permission to find the truth," she said when I told her everything. "You just need proof." She met me in a parking garage an hour later, the air thick with exhaust fumes, and handed me a black flash drive no bigger than my thumb. "Plug this into his server," she said. It tracks deleted signals. It finds the ghosts in the machine. When I did, back at my desk with the door locked, the result hit harder than any gunshot could. The vanished text message, the one that had threatened me, had come from the internal server of Mark's Tactical Solutions. He had used government equipment, resources paid for by taxpayers, to threaten his own stepdaughter. Leela dug deeper from her end, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "He still has contractor credentials," she muttered, her face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. "Level 3 military clearance." Then she froze, her eyes narrowing. A file blinked open on her monitor. Sniper Sim XC. It was a simulation software used for training. The last login line read, "User eMarks Co 27 AM June 9th. That was the exact minute the bullet tore through me. The screen seemed to tilt. The breath left my lungs. Evan hadn't just ordered the hit. He had logged into the system. He had watched it happen. He had sat in safety and comfort while a sniper's scope tracked me through the rain, and he had watched. The thought left a chill under my skin that no uniform could ever hide. He called 2 days later. I didn't want to answer, but I needed to hear his voice, needed to know where he was. "Your mother misses you," he said, his voice calm, almost kind, like a father reading a bedtime story. "Let's not make this ugly, Gus. Come to dinner. Let's talk like family." I agreed, not for peace, and certainly not for a meal, but to see the man who thought fear was still my leash, to get close enough to strike back. The house looked the same, the warm light spilling from the windows, the polished table reflecting the chandelier, the smell of old wood polish trying too hard to mimic comfort, but only managing to smell like a funeral home. My mother smiled like someone bracing for the recoil of a gun. Evan poured wine, his movements precise, mechanical. "Do you still check every mirror before sleeping?" he asked, taking a sip. He remembered every habit he had trained into me, every surveillance pattern he had disguised as concern. When he lifted his glass, the crystal caught the light from the window, casting a thin, distorted reflection across the table. But it wasn't a reflection. It was a red dot painted across my neck, steady and unblinking. My pulse jumped before I could stop it, a visceral betrayal of my body. He noticed. He smiled. "Still afraid of the light, little soldier?" I met his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to blink. "Only when it comes from you." The silence that followed felt heavier than the years we had lost, a physical weight pressing down on the table. The clock ticked in the hallway like a countdown. As I stood to leave, feigning exhaustion, I bent slightly to adjust my shoe, sliding a small magnetic recorder under the lip of the table's edge. It was almost invisible. Behind me, his voice came quiet, almost to himself. "Sometimes you have to teach discipline the hard way." I walked out without looking back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but for the first time, I had caught the monster on tape. Hours later, well past midnight, Leela's call woke me from a fitful sleep. Her voice was sharp, breathless, vibrating with adrenaline. "You need to see this, now." I pulled up the video feed she sent. It was grainy black and white footage from a streetlight camera near the woods where my car had crashed, footage the police had never mentioned to me. The timestamp read 2:03, Evan's car, a sleek black sedan with headlights off, idling near the tree line. The driver's side window was down, and I could see the silhouette of his head, tilted up, watching the road. He hadn't just hired someone. He had been there. He had watched me drive into the trap. He had watched me crash. The rain had followed me across 3 states over the next few days, steady and cold like a warning I couldn't outrun, washing away the tracks but not the guilt. Leela had traced the name Clint Barker to a small town outside Topeka, Kansas. I drove there alone, the rental car eating up the miles, the landscape flattening into an endless gray horizon. Kansas stretched out before me, the kind of place where time itself felt tired, and the sky was so big it felt heavy. The bar was half empty, the lights dimmed to hide what the whiskey couldn't. A jukebox in the corner hummed a country song no one was listening to, a sad twang that echoed in the vast space. In the corner sat a man with gray hair and a limp, one hand trembling violently over a glass of cheap bourbon. I knew it was him. I walked toward him, my heart steady, the recorder hidden deep in my pocket. "You aimed at my heart that night," I said, standing over him. He looked up slowly, his eyes roomy and red, as if deciding whether I was real or just another ghost from his past. "I was told it wasn't a kill," he said after a long moment, his voice like gravel. "Just to scare." I didn't blink. "Who told you that?" he sighed, staring into his drink as if looking for a drowning man. She needs to remember who's in charge, Barker whispered, parroting the words he had been given. So I aimed high, sent her mass but high. And if I had died, Barker's jaw tightened, a flicker of old defiance in his eyes. He said it'd be your fault. Said if you had just obeyed, if you had just followed the discipline, you wouldn't have been there, you wouldn't have made him do it. The words hit harder than I expected because once, a long time ago, I had believed that same lie. I believed that if I was just good enough, just quiet enough, just obedient enough, the pain would stop. I left a photograph on the bar before I turned to go. My father in his flight suit, smiling at a world that hadn't broken yet, full of hope and life. Barker stared at it for a long time, his eyes welling up. Your father fought for freedom, he murmured, his voice cracking. I fought for orders. Maybe that's why men like Marks win. When I reached the door, the cold night air hitting my face, his voice stopped me. He didn't turn around, just tossed a small memory card over his shoulder. It skittered across the table. Dash cam, recorded the handoff. Do what you need to. Seen outside. The rain came down harder, washing the dust from my shoes, but not the weight from my chest. In the motel room later, the smell of stale smoke and cheap detergent filling my nose, I watched the footage. It was shaky, dark, but the audio was clear. 2 cars parked in a field. Evan stepping out, his face illuminated by the dome light of his car. He was passing Barker a stack of bills, thick and bound. His voice came through the speaker, clear, even through the static, devoid of any humanity. Just close enough to make her remember discipline. Don't kill her, just wake her up. The timestamp burned into the corner of the screen. 02:00 a.m. June 9th. The exact minute the bullet tore through me. He hadn't tried to kill me. He had tried to finish his lesson. He thought fear was discipline. He never learned that courage is the silence that refuses to obey. 3 weeks later, the ballroom at the Carolina Veterans Conference Center glowed gold and immaculate, a cathedral of polished glass and good intentions. Banners hung from the high ceilings reading, Mentor of the Year, honoring excellence in leadership. Evan Marks's name shimmered on every program, his photograph grinning from each digital display, looking benevolent and wise. I stood at the back of the room, a dark silhouette against the glittering crowd, dressed in black, blending into the shadows. The air smelled of champagne, expensive starch, and self-congratulation. Men in rows of medals shook hands. Their wives whispered over dessert about new cars and vacations, oblivious to the predator in their midst. No one saw the tremor running beneath my stillness, the electric tension humming in my veins. Beside me, Leela adjusted the comm's earpiece under her hair, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Foster, an agent with the FBI who had finally decided to listen, waited 2 rows ahead, his arms folded, his jaw tight. We had rehearsed this a dozen times in hotel rooms and over encrypted calls, but nothing could steady the weight of what was about to happen. The lights dimmed. The host's voice rang out, proud and rehearsed, booming over the speakers. Tonight, we honor a man who has redefined mentorship, service, and the American spirit. Please welcome Mr. Evan Marks. Applause erupted like gunfire, loud and overwhelming. Evan took the stage with practiced grace, every step controlled, every smile calculated, a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the mask of a leader. He paused before the microphone, scanning the crowd as if basking in his own creation. Leadership isn't about control, he began, his voice rich and steady, echoing the lies he had told me for years. It's about family. A polite murmur of approval followed, heads nodding in agreement. I moved slowly down the aisle, my hands loose at my sides, forcing my breathing to remain slow. He continued, preaching the same sermon he'd always used to hide his cruelty. Because family, he said, his voice dropping to a compassionate whisper, teaches discipline through love. That was my cue. I gave Leela a slight nod. The giant screen behind him flickered, the light shifting from the warm gold of his face to a grainy, cold gray. For a split second, the audience thought it was part of the presentation, a montage of his work until the image sharpened. It was a parking lot, headlights cutting through the dark rain, 2 men standing near a car. One was Evan. The other was Clint Barker. Evan's voice came through the speakers, crystal clear, cold, and unmistakable, louder than it had been in the car that night. Just close enough to make her remember discipline. The room fell silent. The applause died mid-motion, hands frozen in the air. Glasses clinked softly as they were set down, forgotten. Evan turned, his smile faltering, then shattering completely as the footage played again. The envelope of cash was visible in his hand, the date stamp glowing in the corner. June 9th, 02:01 a.m. Every camera in the hall was pointed at him now, the lens of the media crews zooming in on the sweat beading on his forehead. Foster stood up, his badge glinting under the harsh stage lights. Two federal agents moved through the crowd, quiet but deliberate, parting the sea of stunned guests like a knife. Evan spun back toward the microphone, his voice breaking, rising in panic. "She's lying. This is fake. She's unstable. She's always been a selfish, ungrateful child." I stepped forward, the click of my heels the only sound in the room, echoing off the marble floors. I stopped at the edge of the stage and looked straight into the lens of the main broadcast camera. "Family doesn't hire a sniper," I said, my voice calm, steady, cutting through his hysteria. "They hide behind medals and call it love." He lunged toward the mic, his face twisted in rage, but Foster's hand was already on his shoulder, gripping him with the strength of the law. "No, Evan," I said softly, my voice amplified by the microphone he had left behind. "I just stopped obeying." He struggled, shouting something about loyalty, about betrayal, about how I owed him everything, how he made me who I was. But no one was listening. The applause that followed wasn't for him. It was for the truth. As the agents cuffed him, the metal clicking loud in the silence, a red strobe from the police lights outside washed through the windows, cutting across his wrists. For a second, it looked like the laser sight that had once marked my chest in the dark woods. Only now it illuminated his. He tried to twist away from it, turning his face to the ground, but there was nowhere left to hide. From the stage wings, I saw Leela glance at her laptop. Evan had tried to trigger a remote deletion of the files from his pocket, but she smiled, whispering into the comms, "All 3 backups confirmed. Broadcast servers, Pentagon archives, national press." The truth was everywhere. He couldn't erase it anymore. Outside, the rain began, tapping softly against the glass, washing the city clean. Cameras flashed like lightning as Evan was led through the doors, his head hung low. He didn't look back, not at me, not at the crowd that had once adored him. The sound of his shoes echoed off the marble like the last beat of a failing heart. When he was gone, I turned back to the stage. The LED screen went black except for one faint reflection, mine. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the light. "He taught me fear," I said under my breath, barely a whisper, but the microphone caught it. "I taught him consequence." Foster approached quietly, offering a nod that carried more weight than words, a silent acknowledgement of the debt paid. Around us, the audience began to rise, not clapping, not cheering, just standing in a silence heavy with recognition. "Discipline isn't love," I said to the room, to the cameras, to the memory of my father. "It's a weapon in the wrong hands." And tonight, for once, that weapon was no longer his. The lights dimmed again, and in the dark, I felt something I hadn't in decades. Not victory, not revenge, but release, the kind that only comes when truth finally stands taller than the man who tried to bury it. 8 months later, the world had gone quiet again. This time, it was the right kind of quiet. I handed in my resignation, folded the uniform that once defined me and placed it in a box, and left the base without ceremony. There was no anger left, only the strange stillness that follows when the noise finally ends. A letter from my mother waited in the mailbox of the small apartment I was renting in Port Townsend, a coastal town where the air was always salt and pine. Her handwriting trembled across the page, shaky but legible. "I was silent for too long. I thought silence kept us safe. I was wrong. I am so sorry, my Gus." I read it once, absorbing the apology I had waited a lifetime for, and then struck a match. I held the paper until the flame caught, watching it curl in on itself, the ink turning to smoke before drifting through the open window and out into the sky. I didn't burn it out of hate. It was cleansing, not destruction. Some ghosts deserve light only once before they fade. Now my days start with the sound of the tide, a rhythm that matches the beating of my own heart. The house I rent sits on a bluff overlooking the ocean, with an old wooden porch that creaks when the wind moves through it. That's where I teach my survival class, Project Compass. It's a handful of women, all veterans, all bearing the scars of their own wars, learning how to breathe again. Lee, one of the newer ones, lingered after class one Tuesday, her jacket pulled tight against the chill. Her voice was small when she said, "You ever get tired of fighting?" I smiled, feeling the scar under my collarbone pull slightly, a faint reminder of where the bullet entered. "I stopped fighting," I told her, handing her a compass from the supply box. "I started teaching." She hesitated, then confessed that her ex-husband once tracked her car through a hidden GPS chip, that she still looked over her shoulder everywhere she went. I showed her how to find it, how to remove it, how to make sure the signal never comes back. We worked on her car until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange. When she left the porch, she walked toward the shoreline without glancing behind her. I watched until the ocean swallowed her silhouette. That's how I know she is healing. She doesn't need to look back anymore. The sky shifted into the color they call the blue hour, the moment between night and day, when everything feels both alive and weightless. The wind carries salt and laughter from the group still training below. For the first time, silence feels like company, not punishment. I touch the small scar under my collarbone, the faint reminder of where the bullet entered. The sun lifts over the horizon, and I open my journal, writing the only truth that still matters. At 2:00 a.m. that night, a bullet almost stopped my heart. Instead, it started it over. The waves rise and fall like steady breath. The porch groans, and I let the quiet surround me. Not the kind of silence Evan taught me, but the kind I chose for myself. Soft, free, and finally alive. We often think that revenge is about making the other person pay, about causing them the same pain they caused us. But true revenge, the kind that settles in your bones and lets you sleep at night, is about taking back the parts of yourself they tried to steal. It's about standing in the light without flinching, about choosing your own silence over their noise. Augusta didn't just expose a criminal. She dismantled the system of control that had held her hostage for 20 years. She proved that discipline is not about fear, but about the strength to walk away. And in the end, that is the only justice that truly matters. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and let us know in the comments. What's the most satisfying revenge or moment of justice you've ever witnessed or experienced? We read every single one. And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, because the truth always deserves to be heard. Until next time, keep your head up and your compass steady.